celebrate, defend, support, and uplift the voices of the LGBTQIA community. I'm your host, Stephen Chukumba. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Lizette Trujillo.
Hi everyone, Lizette here, she, her, aya. The mission of the Parent Advocate podcast is to elevate conversations and reframe narratives around trans and non-binary youth to help change hearts and minds. Each week, we bring you our take on all things from the perspective of two parents of BIPOC transgender kids.
Today is a super special episode, Lizette.
It's true, I'm so excited. Today's guest is our good friend, Priya Shah. She is joining us today to talk about systemic oppression, coalition building, and resistance.
I'm here for all of it. So welcome everyone once again to the Parent Advocate Podcast. Let's get started. Lizette, give me the goods. What you been up to?
Stephen, I'm so tired, but you hear this every week.
I know, right?
So Monday, we had a really horrible meeting with Senator Kavanaugh around the bathroom ballot referral. And Daniel and this young girl named Maya just really killed it. I was so proud of them. And then later that day, so let me set this up. So Kavanaugh was like argumentative off the top. We centered the youth. Daniel spoke first. Within seconds of Daniel speaking, Kavanaugh cut him off, which made me just on the inside lose my mind. So he was argumentative. But on his way out, because he's like, I have to go to the floor. Like we had a contentious meeting with him for like 20 minutes. He's like, I got to go on the floor. And then he looked over at me and he said, I guess we'll let the voters decide in November, and walked out. Okay.
Oh, he was trying to throw shade.
Yeah, he was. So then, we're driving home, Daniel, Maya, and I, we're driving home. It's been raining all day. And I get a text message from Bridget at HRC Arizona. And she tells me that Senator Bennett was the deciding no vote on this bathroom bill. So essentially killing it, moving it, like stopping it in its tracks.
Nice.
I tell the kids, and then Maya goes, look, the sun's coming out.
Shut your face.
No. And the sun just started coming out of the clouds, and it was just like, it was the moment, right? And Maya, I was like, Maya, you did that. She's like, yeah, I did. Because she had initially met with Bennett 2 weeks prior. And it was just like, it was everything. So
it was everything.
That was that. Also, I had the last episode, I talked about Daniel going on his trip, right? To NAU. He texted me the entire time. He told me everything was okay. But Daniel, obviously, he doesn't hide who he is, right? But he ended up in like a room with like 3 other kids that like their initial question was to him, like, are you homophobic? He was like, no. And then they just were kind of odd. And so he found other friends. He did the things. He didn't spend a lot of time with them. But today he went to practice and he said that he had befriended them on Instagram, like after the trip, and he just told me about the odd interactions. And he's like, I need to keep myself safe. But he, friended them on Instagram, and obviously all his things are in his bio. And he said that they ignored him today. So that's pissed me off, obviously.
That's very weird.
Well, I mean, it's because now they have like a firm understanding of why Daniel isn't homophobic, right? He's a trans kid and queer.
Is that something you start with though? Like, can I just query you a little deeper? Because this is an odd question for someone to ask someone they're just meeting if they're homophobic. Because to ask a question like that presumes that either you are an ally of the LGBTQ population and you're trying to suss out whether or not this person is too, or you're trying to assess whether or not someone is in fact themselves gay, which would then preclude you from wanting to interact with them. So
yeah, and Daniel pushed back on that, like, right? Like, I mean, I'm not sharing the entire story, but like Daniel definitely pushed back on that. He was like, of course I'm not. Like, that's a weird question, all the things. But he said that as like because, like he's with these kids for like 3 days in like a large group. They didn't spend a lot of time in the hotel room. They spent time like as a group and doing the, the conference and like going to all the classes. He just said it was like, the religiosity started to come out and he was like, I need to hang out with other people,
Understood. Yes.
And so he just kept it mum, couldn't wait to come home. But it's interesting because like, these were kids who befriended him and they were like, Daniel, we should all room together. And, it opens up those conversations around like disclosure and like, and Daniel was like, I'm good. I'm safe. It'll be fine, mom. Don't freak out. And then I was like, oh my God, Daniel, this could have gone so differently. So when he told me they ignored him, I was like, this tracks with the conversations they were trying to have with you that weekend. And it's just shitty. It's shitty that our kids encounter people, young people like this, and like
Yes.
in spaces where they're trying to thrive and trying to do well. And it just pisses me off. Another update is I have to be at the Capitol on Wednesday for a trans erasure bill. We're trying to pack the room. So just trying to do like my day, like make sure life is in order before I have to leave. And then we're going to vigil tonight. So it's a jam-packed week, again, mixed with moments of like, Daniel's really good about saying like things don't bother him, but when you meet bigoted people and you encounter bigoted people in your sphere, especially in like your jazz band, it's, for me as his mom, it's upsetting, but things are good. Tell me about you. What's going on with you?
Well, first, I'm with you. It's perfectly okay for you to be upset. And in light of what happened to Nex Benedict, it would be hard for us not to take those types of things to heart. So I'm with you. I feel you. I just want you to know I got your back. In terms of what's up with me, last weekend I was in Maplewood for a vigil for Nex Benedict. Maplewood is one of the more progressive towns in New Jersey. They had a gay mayor, they had the National LGBTQ Task Force, as well as members of Garden State Equality, all present. There were some incredible speeches by trans activists. Actual kids in the community were being centered. There were non-binary children from the high school and the middle school. They're all there to just acknowledge the glory that was Nex Benedict and to really call for changes in the way our school districts, in the way our elected officials talk about and support transgender and non-binary people. So I thought it was important to be there. I took Hobbs, I took Nicole. We were all there in solidarity with Nex and their family. What else? Yesterday, I was at the HRC Federal Club pitch event in Philadelphia. There were some incredible speeches just all night. It was just amazing. Governor Josh Shapiro was there. State Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, who was an amazing orator, Honoree L. Morgan Lee, who made history as the first openly transgender actor to receive a Tony Award nomination for her standout work in A Strange Loop on Broadway. It was everything. It was one of those nights where my batteries were recharged, just being around people who understand what this moment calls for and are putting up their money to make sure that we do everything in our power to fight back against the foolishness that we're encountering. But Lizette, there's so much more we've got to talk about. So let's get to today's topics and really hammer on.
Let's do it.
So, in a historic first, the federal hate crime statute was used to convict a man of killing a transgender woman based on that victim's gender identity. Daquan Ritter was convicted of the 2019 killing of Dime Doe in South Carolina, despite his attempts to burn his clothes, dispose of the murder weapon, produce a false alibi, delete his text messages. Despite all of that, the jury convicted him and sentenced him to life behind bars.
I heard this news story and saw the conviction come through. And while I have issues with the carceral system, I can't help but feel like justice is being served by this woman. And I think about all the trans women, like my dear friend's aunt, who I always promised I would carry forward in my advocacy work, Sable, whose murder was never solved, right? And I think that this is a first step forward in ensuring that trans women, can continue moving forward in some level of safety. It's an unfortunate story and it's a good victory in terms of like justice being met, but it isn't enough, right?
It's not.
A proposed bill in Mississippi, which would allow cisgender inmates to sue if they encountered a fellow inmate who is transgender in a restroom, changing room, or sleeping facility, advanced out of committee on Thursday. HB 585, the Dignity and Safety of Incarcerated Women Act, was introduced by the same Republican who introduced the state's gender-affirming care ban for trans youth last year.
The hypocrisy of the Republican Party is astounding. The people who have essentially created the prison industrial complex, who've used the 13th Amendment to ensure that people who are incarcerated have absolutely no rights, are suddenly the champions of inmate rights to prevent inmates from having to be in the same space as transgender people. Like, have you ever heard of something so hypocritically ludicrous in your life?
I mean, I'm muted, but my expression says it all. Like, you are on point on everything that you're saying.
Child, I can't even. I can't even. However, in furtherance of the fuckery, in a setback for transgender youth in Indiana, a federal appeals court has allowed Indiana's ban on gender affirming care for transgender youth to go into effect immediately. A U.S. district court in Indiana had issued a preliminary injunction last June that blocked enforcement of the law, which was set to go into effect July 1st. But Tuesday, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit placed a stay on that injunction, essentially letting the law be enforced.
This is a reminder, a clear reminder to parents of trans youth who do not show up to state houses or to lobby to try to stop these bills because they believe that the courts will do right by their children. This is a reminder of why we do not rely on the courts. This is a reminder of why we need to affect positively change and affirming love for our trans loved ones to ensure that these types of bills are stopped. Like, it's so upsetting to think that the well-being of our children is in the hands of people who will never know them, right? And so it's the most disappointing ruling, and makes me even more nervous about the ACLU's request to have gender affirming care heard at the SCOTUS level. So tummy and knots, obviously. On Monday, students walked out of Owasso High School in Oklahoma to protest bullying against LGBTQ plus students and show solidarity with the local queer community after the tragic death of student Nex Benedict. The walkout was organized by Cassidy Brown, a graduate of Owasso, who told the reporters that they hope to bring awareness to the school's inadequate protections for LGBTQ plus students and in action against the bullying taking place in the school.
I'm so proud of those youth because when you see the adults around you failing to take action, when you see the adults around you just asleep at the wheel, when you see the adults around you actually enabling the violence and harm that comes to the youth, it's so impressive that they took matters into their own hands to call attention to the inaction taking place at the school. I'm so proud of them. And I think it only bodes well for the future of our youth when they start taking this type of stance in response to failure of adults and elected officials to act. But Lizette, here we go down the rabbit hole again, but we have got to get to our guest.
Let's get to it.
Dr. Priya Shah is an adjunct professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies and an adjunct professor of Ethnic Studies at Irvine Valley College. Dr. Shah received her PhD from UC Irvine in 2008. She has been teaching gender and sexuality studies, queer studies, and ethnic studies at various community colleges, Cal State, and UCs. Dr. Shah serves on the board of Equality California, Orange County Equality Coalition, and works closely with the Human Rights Campaign. In addition to all of that, she is an advocate for LGBTQ plus youth and racial justice in K-12 schools. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Priya J. Shah to our show.
Welcome to the show, Priya. We're so excited just to have you here. And also, I just want to say, because we all, the three of us love 90s hip hop, that when Stephen at one point said PhD, all I thought in my head was player hated degree. And I just kind of wanted to giggle.
Well,
so I wanted to share
have
that with y'all.
too. I have that too. I've earned that in the past few years. Yes. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you, Priya. You're a professor of gender, sexuality, and queer studies. If this was a 101 class, what would you say is the most foundational concept we have to understand in order to address this political moment?
I would say we need to understand that the binaries that shape our view of sex and gender are false, one, and that we need to understand the way race and gender and class work together in American society right now.
Can you elaborate a little bit more for our listeners on
definitely
examples?
Yes, definitely. So a lot of if we're talking specifically right now about Republican attacks on women's reproductive health, as well as reproductive justice more broadly, and anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ legislation, then a lot of that stems from a misunderstanding or a purposeful misunderstanding of what gender and sex look like. And we can talk more about that as we go on. But we also need to understand that they're building on a longer legacy of controlling marginalized societies using various strategies. And so it's all wrapped up in ways in which people have been regulated by virtue of their class, their race, their gender, their sexuality throughout American history. So it's not really just this one moment in time that we're seeing these kinds of attacks.
What do you find is the most common misconception your students have when they first walk into your classroom?
If we're talking about my gender and sexuality studies students, I would say that the biggest misconception is that gender and sex are binary. So we call that the binary sex gender system. This idea that even before you come out of the womb, that through ultrasound, a physician can identify your sex based simply on whether or not the fetus looks like they have a penis. And then that sex will correlate with what you look like coming out of the womb. And that finally your gender identity will correlate with that assigned sex. When I talk it out like that, and it sounds complicated, but we do this all the time, right? So if you think about gender reveal parties, what they are is simply this kind of assumption, one, that with an ultrasound machine, someone can tell you the sex of your baby. And the fact that it's called a gender reveal party already shows us that we mistake those words. We conflate them. So first of all, what we're saying is we assume that assigned sex or sex, biological sex, can be determined by the appearance of a penis. That's literally all that the ultrasound tech is looking for. And that secondly, then that tells you something about who that baby will be when they come out of the womb, which is why we use colors that we associate with gender identities. For example, right, blue for boys, pink for girls. And that finally, that person will kind of have this very simplistic and reductive correlation between whether or not they have a penis, their gender identity, and the way they perform either their masculinity or femininity out in the world throughout their entire life. You can even add sexuality to that. So we also assume cross-sex desire, even on babies. And if you want, I can tell you examples of that. But simple things, right? Like a little baby boy that smiles at women will say things like, "Oh, he's going to be a player. He's going to break all the girls' hearts," right? It's this correlation we assume between sex, gender, and sexuality within a binary system, male or female.
Okay, I just want everybody to appreciate just jewels and knowledge is being dropped on this show. We started with a hip hop reference about PhDs, player hater degrees. Now we're dropping jewels, okay? And jewels are knowledge gems being dropped on this podcast. So just pay attention, get your notebooks out, get your pens and pads, press record because you're getting like a real breakdown. So let's talk bathrooms. We know that the first anti-trans bathroom bill, which thankfully failed to pass, was filed in Arizona in 2013. And at the time, we had no real understanding of what was to follow. For our listeners, why are bathrooms such a concern for the GOP?
Stephen, if I could take one step back, I just want to clarify that that binary sex gender system we just talked about is actually not a biological truth or some sort of extant reality. And so, it's really a concept that began to take form in the West in scientific discourse around the turn to modernity. So I'm just going to put that out there, that binary sex gender system is actually not how sex, gender, and sexuality work. It's a lot more vast than that. Coming to your question about bathrooms, we have been regulating bathrooms and public spaces for the entire time that we have been a nation. So the anti-trans bathroom bills are new in the sense of targeting transgender people, but in fact, bathrooms have been a kind of space in which we play out ideas of who belongs in a society and who does not, who is seen as clean and who is not, who is seen as inherently contaminating and who is not. So I am not surprised in some ways that we're seeing bathrooms and schools, again, something that we have been basically regulating since the beginning of our nation, even prior to being a nation. And I can talk to you a little bit about why those spaces particularly and kind of some examples of how that's looked in the past.
Well, let's delve into that because the GOP seems inordinately preoccupied with regulating bathrooms, regulating bodies. So can we talk about why that's the case?
I think there's a number of reasons, in my understanding. One, I think just cynically, they have recognized that targeting perhaps the smallest and most vulnerable population among us is a relatively quote unquote safe tactic for them, because the group itself cannot fight back in the way, let me think about that, how to put that exactly. Okay, I think at the most cynical level, the GOP is targeting probably the most vulnerable group among us, a group that is in numbers relatively small. And on top of that, they tend to target children within that group. So just on a cynical level, they found a strategy that they believe fires up their base, while they get small amounts of resistance because not very many people understand that this group or the issues surrounding them. So that's one. I think two, they have chosen bathrooms because bathrooms have historically been this place where there's a lot of fear about different groups of people interacting with one another or meeting one another or encountering one another. And so we already have this kind of like learned fear about bathrooms, and then you attach it to the latest group that you want to target. So schools and bathrooms are something that we have been taught. Those of us who get to belong in this society have been taught are spaces where we can be violated. And those of us who have been taught that we do not belong and that we are a threat to others have always felt uncomfortable in those spaces because there's hyper scrutiny. So that's why schools and that's why bathrooms. I wanted to talk to you both a little bit about how bathrooms have been regulated historically. Unfortunately, it didn't start with anti-trans bathroom bills, right? Most people are probably familiar with Jim Crow laws in the South that were put into place after the emancipation of the enslaved population, and their very intentional, cogent demand for rights during the Reconstruction, their participation in legislation, their participation in Southern society, right? After that period, we really have a reconsolidation of white supremacy. That's the time you see the KKK come into being, right? It's a way to control a population that had been emancipated and been given rights from 3 different amendments in the Constitution. How do you once again disenfranchise them? There's so much we can talk about there, but one of the ways is through these. Originally was the Black Codes that were pretty much put into place immediately after emancipation, right, to control Black people and their labor and their bodies. So I'm sure, you two and many of your listeners are familiar with the way even the 13th Amendment like recreated a system of slavery within a carceral system. Right. So It's in the minute we are seeing freedom, we're also seeing a retrenchment of a kind of way to control, especially young Black men. And in the South, the Jim Crow laws, one of the most traditional examples of Jim Crow laws are water fountains and bathrooms, right? And we've most of us have seen those images of water fountains and bathrooms with colored on top or whites only. So that I think most of us are familiar with, even though we might not have been taught very much about Reconstruction in the period that followed it. We are used to seeing those images.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, those are unfortunately, were so common and such a reality of life. But in the North and the West, we didn't have Jim Crow in terms of de jure laws, but we did have de facto segregation. So I teach California history through the ethnic studies lens. And already, from the very beginning of the state of California, we see both written into law and practiced de facto just out in the world, we see modes of segregation. As early as 1885, actually, the family of a Chinese girl, the Tate family, sues the San Francisco school district for not allowing her to go to the quote unquote white school that was close to her house, right? So 1885. And they sued. The California Supreme Court ruled that public education had to be open to all children. This is 1880s. And then you just go a few more years into the 1900s, you already have, despite that ruling, separate schools for children of Mexican descent all throughout the Southwest. I'm just going to stick to California. California, so we can kind of follow the thread. In particular, the students who are deemed the undesirables, this is going to be like the theme throughout this history, are students who don't speak English or are quote unquote too brown. In 1926, Playground Commission of Los Angeles officially segregates its recreation centers and swimming pools. So again, let's talk about these public spaces where there's fear of bodies interacting, encountering one another, the fear of contamination. And I mean that in the symbolic, metaphorical way, but I also mean that sadly in just a literal way. There were fears about bodies of color bearing disease. And Black children in Los Angeles were only allowed to use the public swimming pool once a week, after which it would be drained and quote unquote clean water would be put back into the pools.
I mean, I've seen those
Mexican
videos. I'm sorry, I've seen those videos of white people throwing bleach in the pool on Black kids while they're in the pool. So I know exactly when you're talking about contamination, it was like literal. It was a literal fear of contamination. I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah, Stephen, and that kind of really visceral feeling we get when we see things like that. If you look at discourse like in newspapers or political cartoons is another really good place to look. But you see that similar kind of contamination discourse around Chinese in California, this idea literally that they carry disease, that they are dirty inherently, they're spreading disease. They're blamed for, the outbreak of the plague in San Francisco. So that carries on from the beginning of the state all the way now we're in like the 1920s. We still have that discourse tied up in eugenics and kind of all of those ideas, right? And Mexican children, because they weren't allowed to even at times use swimming pools locally, would actually have to go to the river, and they would call that their beach, right? Even though it was inland. Lizette, you and I were talking, and I was telling you about Sal Castro's autobiography, where he talks about going to Marano Beach, which is actually an inland river. I wanted to pull out this quote because I thought that it really gets to the heart of what's happening. He writes, we used to go to the Marano Beach, which is actually an inland river, quote, to compensate for the discrimination and exclusion in swimming pools and parks. So they were completely discriminated against, excluded from these public spaces. Things that I think today, most of us, especially cisgender people, take for granted. Swimming pool access, right? Or bathrooms, I think have continued to be a place of a lot of fear for marginalized people. But I think swimming pools are something we don't talk about very much, the way they were regulated.
So I'm gonna jump in because we actually have a whole lot of questions, and I feel like
sorry.
I'm in class. No worries. So Lizette.
Well, I was going to say, because this is something that you and I talk about all the time. And obviously, I'm not a Chicano studies or a Chicanx studies or gender studies major expert, but I'm always drawing parallels because for me, like the things that we are seeing, legislation on what pronouns and names can be used in the classroom, that very much was like my parents' experience on whether they were going to be Mary, Maria, Pedro, or Peter, right? Like, or just like language restrictions around whether you could speak your native language in the classroom, right? And these things, these types of restrictions are not new. I think we all have a mutual friend whose Latina daughter was not allowed to drink out of a certain water fountain because they made one boy and one girl water fountain. And so like you saw these water fountain segregation things happening, ironically or unironically, happening to trans youth. What do you wish activists, because often this history is lost on activists, right? Our movement leaders and teachers would know about the importance of creating inclusive spaces and inclusive classrooms. What do you wish? What are like 3 things you wish that they continuously touched on to ensure that like intersectionality was being centered, that inclusion was really there when we're talking about movement and when we're talking about classrooms?
Okay, I want to start with classrooms. And I think the first thing that, I know I kind of get into professor mode and like go through all of this, but the reason is for us to understand that teachers, superintendents, city council, school board people, they're the people who are making rules and policies about who can go where in a community. And if you can't go to all the places in your community, then you don't belong in your community, right? So let's just understand that access to public space is a marker of belonging, that children who are told they can go to a pool once a week because they're dirty, or they can't go at all, or they have to go to a separate school. First of all, those are decisions made by people in their community for the most part. Doesn't tend to be that far away from those young people themselves. These are people they see in their community every day. And the message is very clear. There's no ambiguity about what this is telling them about who they are, their families, and their relationship to that space. So that's why we need to understand this history. Secondly, that also means that it's teachers and superintendents and staff that have the power to do something about it, because they were the people that had the power to segregate students, and they did. But that also means they have the power to create inclusive spaces. So one excuse I hear a lot of times is like, oh, it's out of my hands. This is not something that I have control over. The parents, no. They are the ones that are shaping school culture and access to space. So it's a way of empowering people and parents as well to understand the same people that create segregation are the same people who can get rid of segregation. So we all need to understand that we need to be part of the process. We cannot wait for somebody to do it for us. They're not coming. And then the other thing is that historically, we have worked together across identities to push back against discriminatory laws, policies, and activity. So that's what I tell my students in ethnic studies, that every example of oppression and discrimination has multiple examples of challenges to it. So we are not powerless by any means, nor have our ancestors been. And that also the groups that are being negatively harmed have always worked together to push back. Not always, but at its best, across ethnic identity, across racial identity, across gender identity, people have worked together, and that's when we've seen the most success. So we don't have to build something new that's never been there before.
So I want to follow up, because we've seen people like Stephen Miller with America First Legal really focus on funding anti-trans media campaigns that really just serve to misinform Black and Brown and Spanish-speaking communities. What are tangible ways that this anti-trans legislation impacts BIPOC communities?
Well, first of all, it creates more, if we can kind of break it down between, I guess we can talk about bathrooms and schools at the same time. What it does is it creates more hyper-surveillance of schools, of public bathrooms, and of bathrooms in school spaces. Now, what we need to help our Black and Brown siblings understand is when there's hyper-surveillance, it's our children who get punished, who get targeted, who get attacked. So if you know the history of how Black Latina people have been segregated in bathroom spaces, then you understand that there's that hyper scrutiny is going to lead once again to Black and Brown bodies seen as out of place. Guaranteed, 100%. We're not that far away from that kind of surveillance. So, Stephen, I think the first thing I'd say is a lot of the way these bills work is they literally create some sort of watchdog watching spaces like bathrooms. For example, even in our school district, somebody had proposed, a parent, I believe, had proposed a watchdog group of parents literally going from bathroom to bathroom to ensure that the wrong bodies are not in the bathroom. Now, those wrong bodies are brown bodies, Black bodies, and genderqueer bodies. There's not a lot of distinction among those. So we need to help people explain that when there's hyper-surveillance, all of our children are harmed. Another way that this harms our communities is because it reinstates this idea of what like a normal girl looks like and what a normal boy looks like. Well, Black women historically have been told that their bodies are not that of normal women, because this idea of the normal woman is based on a Western European white female body. So, you know, I do a whole kind of discussion and lecture on the way in which Black bodies, Black female bodies especially, get racialized and gendered. You could look at sports, you could look Olympics specifically, you could look at the way many African female players right now are being forced to either stop playing, take dangerous treatments, have surgery in order to fit the bylaws of who gets to play as a female. It's often Black girls who get told that they're too manly or hypermasculine because the norm is set in this very rigid, non-universal way. So when we have laws, these anti-trans laws, what they're doing is they're creating these or recreating categories of what counts really as a normal girl. They're not policing masculinity in the same way, right? So brown and Black girls, again, will fall into the category of not fitting those rigid norms.
You actually raise an ancillary question I wanted to ask, because these anti-trans legislation also impacts women. And you've actually kind of gone into the ways in which they have
Completely,
detrimentally
100%.
impacted women. But I want you to elaborate a little, because that's where I think you were going.
Yeah, tell us why TERFs are whack. Like, tell us why the things that they are trying to say and the ways that they're trying to create more misinformation and fear around trans women and trans bodies is just wrong.
So just saying TERFs, I'm triggered. Okay, let me think. So they're fundamentally misunderstanding feminism. I can't stand the name because I actually don't believe that that's not what feminism is. Like, if Audre Lorde and Angela Davis and Bell Hooks could all speak to this, right? They would say, this is a complete misunderstanding of feminism. This is the worst example of reductive Western feminism. But let me explain why. So TERFs, trans radical exclusionary feminists, is what that stands for, basically reduce women to their genitalia, just like those we were fighting used to do. So in the 19th century, even 18th century, for example, in Europe, women were told that literally because of the size of their nerves, they were too sensitive to be out in the world, especially in the industrializing world, right? That their bodies their literal physiology was not made to be out of the home. And that on top of, if they were middle class and upper middle class, right? But this kind of physiology is your destiny argument that was used against women, against their ability to vote, against their ability to go for higher education, the whole gamut. So that's what TERFs are doing, is they're basically reducing women once again to the question of genitalia. And I just mean outer genitalia, not even the full scope of reproductive organs, okay?
You and I were recently on one of our classic car ride chats. I think when we're both either picking up our kids or dropping them off. And you taught me a history lesson on coalition building, which you touched on a little bit before. I was telling you, gosh, everyone's so polarized. How do we coalition build in this really difficult moment? And you literally schooled me. You were like, Lizette, we've done this before. We just have to look back to what we've done. And it inspired me. So will you inspire our listeners?
Thank you. Yes. No, I'm inspired every day that I get to teach this history, because it's such a good reminder that polarization is not just how it has to be. I think that it's been normalized, right? And we know from studying colonial histories that this is the number one way that colonizers conquered lands that should have been a lot more powerful and should have been able to fight back, was the classic divide and conquer, right? So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it today. So the Stephen Millers of the world will tell you that when there's anti-trans laws, that has nothing to do with Black and brown people. And that, in fact, pro-LGBTQ inclusive policies somehow hurt Black and brown children. We've talked about the way that's not true by any means, but it's a classic way they use to divide us. And I think that I'll just use, again, my local situation. I see that at play. So we had a CRT ban being proposed, and I felt like not everybody understood how that affected their children unless immediately that they were Black Americans, or they were actually familiar with what critical race theory is. So there was a kind of a silo there. And then when the ethnic studies came up and was banned, that was seen as a quote unquote Latine issue. And it was harder to get people from other communities to participate, right? So as long as that's happening, they're going to succeed. But the example I was giving you, Lizette, that I was so excited about the other day, actually in 1904, Oxnard is a really, and anyone, do either of you know where Oxnard, California is by any chance? Have you heard of it? Okay, yes, Stephen, you have. So you see some incredible coalition building and multiracial, multi-ethnic resistance in Oxnard because it's a sugar beet area, right? The sugar beet factories are established there at the turn of the century. That's the big industry there. And they recruit labor. So this is how you get people from very different backgrounds in the same place. Because according to the way labor was kind of understood at the time, you try to bring the people you think are meant to do this kind of backbreaking work, basically, that you can exploit in this backbreaking work. And so you had Japanese and Mexican migrant workers working next to each other in Oxnard on the sugar beet farms. And the treatment was so bad that in 1704, actually, they joined together to strike, even though they didn't even many times speak each other's languages, that they understood in that moment that all of them were being harmed and that the only way they were going to be able to push back is if they worked together across language, across, so many different identities. That's 1904. In 1970s in Oxnard, it was a Black child and a Mexican child who sued the school district for segregation. Again, right? Understanding that it's only when we come together that we have the power to really launch a resistance. As long as we say, oh, this is just your community's problem, they're going to win. And California is full of examples like this. My favorite one is the Punjabi Mexican community. I was calling Lizette to tell her about that community, about how Punjabi farmers and Mexican women who were fleeing the revolution found each other despite horrific discrimination in the fields, and got married, and they would both put brown as their race because they recognized nobody cared as long as it was two brown people involved. Stephen, I think you'll love this one. I also found out something I had never learned before, that the first South Asian immigrants, like en masse to the East Coast, were Bengali Muslim salespeople who came to New Orleans and married Creole and Black women. And that was the neighborhood they were accepted in. And they created an entire community of South Asian, Creole, and Black families that once they moved to New York, created something they called Bengali Harlem. These are old stories. We have been doing this from the beginning.
That's amazing. That's amazing. You actually answered the question that I was going to ask you, which was, what are 3 key lessons from past movement building that we can draw on today? And you just ran through like 5 or 6 of them. And I think it's important what you're saying, because I don't believe that people really appreciate just how effective the right is at dividing and conquering. If you have people pit against each other, if you have parents of cis kids thinking that trans and non-binary kids are going to do you harm or going to cause your children to convert to transgenderism, if you have Black people thinking that the LGBTQ people are some sort of devilish cult that are going to convert your children, if you have white people against Black people, as long as you're keeping people separated and divided, they can be effective. Once we stop allowing those chasms to grow between us with misinformation, disinformation, and intentional malicious deceit, I think we can really be effective in stopping the tide of hate. How do we get there? How do we get to the point where we remember the movements of the past and apply those lessons today?
Well, first of all, I think this is why the push for ethnic studies is so important. And right now in California, we have 2 laws that have gone into effect and are going into effect that mandate at least 1 course of ethnic studies in college, Cal States and community colleges, and then 1 in high school. Of course, the rollout is going to be a huge challenge. Implementation is a challenge. But just being able to learn accurate history of these movements that until, I started studying this, I didn't know any of this. And so history. Okay, so 1, we need to, but ethnic studies, that's great for the people that are still in school. What about people our age? So I've been really thinking about how do we get these stories out into the world? Your podcast is a really good example of that. We need to be creative in how we put these stories out in the world, right? It can't just be in the school setting. It has to be this kind of model of continuous education that we do for our communities. I don't don't mean anybody top down comes into our communities. No, we need to take that on our shoulders and do that within our communities. We have so many tools now to do it. There's really no reason not to. So education. The other thing is those of us who have an ability to do so need to make those cross-class, cross-racial, cross-gender identity coalitions. Like we need to put ourselves in spaces where we are talking to people who do not have all of the same experiences we do, because we need to model it. But I think more importantly, we need to build grassroots coalitions that are legitimately diverse from their foundation. And I don't mean diverse in like the superficial way. I mean diverse in thinking, diverse in life experience. Like we need, and that's not always being done, right? Even in organizing on the left. We know that. I mean, that's Lizette and I's constant conversation. It's not easy work to do because that kind of drumbeat of silos is so strong. There's that zero-sum mentality is so strong. We have all internalized it, right? This idea that if this group gets some help, our group is getting less. We need to understand that that's just a mythology that's been used to keep us docile and really push back. So when you hear people in your own community say things like that, you need to step up and say, no, that's not actually, did you know that there's this, or that's not actually how it works. Actually, our kids are also not learning what they're going to need when they go out into the corporate world. I have my best friend who is really involved in corporate DEI, right? And she's telling me, like, if our kids aren't learning these things in high school, they will be unable to hold a good corporate job out in the world. And maybe that speaks to people, right? That's their expectation for their young people. Well, if you're not learning critical race, if you're banning critical race theory, you're banning ethnic studies, now you're banning books, you're banning any discussion of people with different experiences, how are those kids going to function like out in the world? So I think it's reminding people.
So there's a book that I've been reading slowly, well, on Audible. It's called An African American and Latinx History of the United States by Paul Ortiz. And what you're saying reminds me of this quote that he said: "Herein lies a new way to understand American history. The radical ideas of Frederick Douglass and the Christian Recorder, as well as the editors of El Malcriado, were generated in social movements where people came together to learn how to overturn slavery and other forms of dominion. Placing these struggles at the heart of the historical narrative allows us to re-envision the vibrant past that shines a path for every individual that learns for a more democratic future." So I was just so inspired by that car ride we had that I was like, I'm gonna find some books and I'm gonna like get on this.
Actually send me that quotation?
I will.
And you know what? It's exactly what was said in that quotation. It is about democracy and thriving in a vibrant democracy. And you can't tell me that any of our people don't want that.
You just raised this concept of a thriving democracy. And as an educator, as a person who teaches, when you look at what's happening in our country, specifically the erosion of democracy, and I feel like a large part of our population's complicity in what's happening. Again, what advice do you have for, in this instance, specifically for parents of transgender children who are watching the erosion of democracy happening, to both fight against this erosion and simultaneously protect their kids in this moment? What advice do you have for them?
The first part is to act. That our fundamental responsibility in a democracy, in a society, and in a family is to act for the benefit of all. So everyone will tell you to keep your head down. No. That's how the status quo is maintained. That's how we got to where we are. You know, when you talk about complicity, Stephen, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about all the people who said, you know what? No, I'm gonna keep my head down. This is scary. You know, no. Especially if your child is the target of such vitriol that it's so hard to wrap our heads around. In order to protect them, you need to be an actor in what is happening in our society. So that's part one. Part two is that we need to, I'm still trying to like work this through, but I think we need to remove our egos as parents and adults. I think that's what gets in the way. And it starts by unconditionally loving your child, but then it's listening to them and not centering ourselves in the advocacy, which is something that we have to constantly rethink, right? It's got to be action, but also presence and listening. Like, I'm not sure what that balance looks like yet, but I think the only way we know the right thing to do is if we're actually learning and listening. So all of us who don't share our children's identities have a lot of learning to do and probably unlearning to do. And that has to be simultaneous with the commitment to action. Does that kind of make sense, the way those come together?
Absolutely. That unlearning is like essential to everything. The unlearning and recognizing, I think too, like I think about this in support spaces, because obviously I run a support space, and I always tell the parents, I grew here, but I learned more when I connected with trans people. Because it's no longer a secondary experience, right? It becomes a deep empathy for someone else's lived experience directly.
But you can only gain that if you come with humility into that space. And
yes,
I just feel that a lot of times cis parents tend to take up a lot of that space not with listening and learning. And, that's where history comes in too, recognizing how much we have benefited from Black queer movements. None of us would be sitting here today without those in various ways.
Yes, 1,000%. I can't thank you enough for coming on to our podcast and for dropping all of this expertise and knowledge, all the things you rained
jewels on
justice
our domes
on us. Yes.
What a joy it has been to be with the both of you and talk about these things that all three of us are thinking about all the time, to really help us clarify the work that we're doing and that others are doing, right? The clarity of what needs to be done and what we need to do.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you.
Priya, thank you so much.
You.
Love you. Stay well. Can't wait till the next time we are able to break bread and share hugs together.
I know. I miss you.
Yes, I cannot wait. Love you both. Thank you for what you're doing.
Bye.
Bye, Mama.
Now it's time for a recurring segment, Allies and Assholes, where we highlight individuals or groups that are supporting the LGBTQIA community on the one hand and call out straight up assholes who are trying to move us all backwards on the other. Lizette, who are we talking about today?
Our ally of the week is U.S. Senator Laphonsa Butler of California. Senator Butler, the first Black lesbian in the chamber, kicked off a series of readings from banned books on the Senate floor with an excerpt from the work of Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. Butler began by invoking the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and its guarantee of freedom of speech and the press without government interference. In 2022, more than 2,500 books were targeted nationwide, a majority of them about Black or LGBTQIA people.
Senator Butler specifically chose Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, a collection of speeches and essays that tell the story of our nation, its legacy, and the people who contribute to America's character of imperfection, of resilience, and of progress.
And this is why Laphonsa Butler is our ally of the week.
Congratulations to Senator Butler. Now onto our asshole of the week. Our asshole of the week is another Oklahoma elected official. This time, it's Republican State Senator Tom Woods. Senator Woods was caught on a recording of a panel in the wake of Nex Benedict's death, referring to Benedict and other LGBTQ plus people as, and I quote, that filth. Woods was recorded saying, "My heart goes out to that scenario. If that is the case, we're a Republican state, supermajority in the House and Senate. I represent a constituency that doesn't want that filth in Oklahoma."
Can you believe that? In the midst of the horrific death of a child after being viciously beaten by other kids at school, it's unconscionable that he could even utter such a statement. I can't with these people. They make me angry. It makes me worried for all of our children.
And that's why Senator Tom Woods is our asshole of the week. Well, that's our show for today, folks. I want to thank today's guest, Dr. Priya J. Shah, for joining us today. And of course, I got to give it up to my co-host, Lizette Trujillo, for being on point all day, every day.
Thanks, Stephen. You know that I got you. I'm your ride or die. I'm like pulling up, being like, get in, Stephen. Let's go make the world better. Right. And of course, we couldn't do this without all of you, our listeners. So thanks for tuning in to the Parent Advocate Podcast.
And folks, please be sure to like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as do all the things you need to stay up to date with everything going on here at the Parent Advocate Podcast. Goodbye.
Goodbye.